Now let's come to the specifics of corporate governance effectiveness in the Indian market. Indian market has drastically improved in terms of the regulations or the policies that relate to corporate governance practices listed by the firms listed in India. And this happened mainly due to a lot of committees that have been set up in the last 1 decade and that have been transformed into various practices where we can now measure the effectiveness of corporate governance of the Indian firms. However, the basic question we all have on back of our mind is that irrespective of increase in the regularities in the corporate governance practices, why would you come across where firms are exposed to serious frauds? One big example happens to be Satyam Computers in the recent past. You have to keep one thing in mind, that regulators and regulations are always reactive measures. They are not proactive measures. In other words, they are not designed primarily to foresee the frauds. They're mainly designed to protect investors against the effects of frauds. In other words, it's like an ex post measure than being an ex ante measure. The more proactive measure is the participation of the stakeholders, the effectiveness of the stakeholders' participation. And many firms do distort many financial figures or health of the firms. Especially these are very hard to detect, and that's why market cannot react immediately, which reflects that participants or the stakeholders can't really read the numbers due to the distortions. So one way you can improve the effectiveness of the regulation is to reduce the degree of distortion, maybe through accounting standards. In a way, the accounting standards in India are pretty good. It's not that they are poor, or they're as good as you come across in most of the developed nations. The other way is to improve the degree of participation by all stakeholders. One common evidence you come across when you look into the corporate governance literature is that many markets have very good standards of regulation, and the law is quite strict. The penalties as per law are huge, but the problem is it's not being enforced, especially in markets which are relatively less developed. Enforcement is a problem. But you have to appreciate that these markets, as I discussed earlier, do not have well-developed institutions. And on top of that, there is no coordination among these institutions. Enforcement of law is not just by the stock market regulator, SEBI. It should be a collective effort of the whole system. Say, for example, a bank, etc. They have to coordinate. At the same time, the courts need to be more proactive in terms of enforcement. So you can't really blame one particular party that India has very weak enforcement. One issue is as a nation it is developing, so you expect that the enforcement of law is relatively ought to be relatively low. And at the same time, unless you have very well developed institutions, coordination among institutions is not that easy. There is a common complaint that there are many laws, for example, the Chapter 11 or bankruptcy code that exists in the US and some of the markets, and we don't have the same kind of mechanism in India to protect, say, the creditors or even the investors. So, in other words, there are more laws and enforcement that happens in the US compared to a market like India. So one thing you have to appreciate is that enforcement on its own is not cheap, right? So when you have less monitoring costs, then enforcement is can happen with less frictions. Let's assume you have a market where there are many cases of bankruptcies. On one hand, the creditors lose. On the other hand, you have to incur a lot of legal costs and monitoring costs on top of that, those who have become bankrupt. So in a way, it's not optimal unless markets are evolved enough that enforcement can happen in a relatively more smoother fashion. So for India, right now, I would